Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to your Happy School Symposium. It's great to see the well-being of students getting increasing attention, particularly in the world in which we live today. Globalization and digitalization have connected people, cities, countries, and continents in ways that vastly increase our individual and also our collective potential. But the same forces have also made the world more complex, more volatile, more ambiguous. The world has seen a growing disconnect between the infinite growth imperative and the finite resources of our planet, between the financial economy and the real economy, between the wealthy and the poor, between what is technologically possible and the social needs of people, between governance and the often voicelessness of people. I don't want to hold education responsible for all of that. But we should never underestimate the role that the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, the values of people play in shaping the social, the cultural, the economic context in which we live. In this world, education is no longer just about teaching students something, but about helping them develop a reliable compass and the tools to navigate with confidence and optimism through this increasingly volatile, uncertain world. Young people need not just to be academically successful, but they also need to be able to live with themselves, to live with people who are different from them, to live with this planet. Success in education today is about building curiosity, opening minds. It's about compassion, opening hearts. And it's about courage, mobilizing our cognitive, social, emotional resources to take action. And those are also our best weapons against the biggest threats of our times. Ignorance, the closed mind. Hate, the closed heart. And fear, the enemy of agency. And then we find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic that has shown us how vulnerable our education systems are to external disruptions. And the future is always going to surprise us. Climate change will disrupt our lives a lot more than this pandemic, and artificial intelligence is going to put our education systems to a real test. We know how to educate second-class robots, people who are very good at repeating what we told them. But what's going to make us human in a world in which the kind of things that are easy to teach and easy to test have also become easy to digitize, to automate? And there are going to be many other forces that, put our education systems to a real test. In our international PISA assessments, we ask school leaders, to what extent do you consider the big themes of our times in your curriculum? And it seems that actually schools do a lot. You can see here 9 out of 10 school leaders say, yeah, climate change is part of our school curriculum already. Or gender equality, international conflicts, poverty, migration, you name it. But when we surveyed students, we got a different impression. On the one hand, you can see that also here, 8 out of 10 young people see the climate agenda as really important, as urgent for their even personal lives. But when we ask students, can you do something about it? Or do you believe what you do is going to make a difference for people in other places? And often the bars in this chart got a lot shorter. And that's really the crux in our education systems. We have made young people often passive consumers of prefabricated content. But we do not do enough to enable them to develop that agency, that capacity to mobilize their cognitive, social, and emotional resources to take action, to do something. And that is what the world needs today. And interesting, in our last PISA assessment, we looked at the students' growth mindset. On the right side of this chart, you find countries in which students see the sky as the limit to their development. If they try hard, they believe they can reach beyond their current capacities. They can overcome all difficulties. You can find a country like Estonia. On the left side, We find countries where students believe, I'm born with a certain intelligence and there's nothing I can do about it, so why should I study hard? And on the vertical axis, you see the quality of learning outcomes of education systems as measured by the global PISA test. And you can see in most countries the two things go together now. Those attitudes, the mindset of young people, their openness to the future, to challenges, a very important predictor for the quality even of academic knowledge and skills. And in fact, that's exactly what we saw. We saw students who have a growth mindset or they were motivated to master difficult tasks. Now, you could see actually they had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They were less afraid of failure. No? And think about this. If you want young people who are creative, you have to give them space to experiment. If they experiment, they take risks. If they take risks, they make mistakes. If our education systems do not help young people to learn with and from mistakes, maybe they will not be so creative. Today, we live in a world in which there is, exponentially kind of an inflation of knowledge. Vast amounts of knowledge. And most of them actually are incredible hard to comprehend. But they all come through people. Learning is never a transactional process. It's always a social, relational experience. And we all know that. The things that we remember today were the things that we learned in a context of a social relationship with our teachers. From teachers who understood who we were, who we wanted to become, and who accompanied us on our journey. Compared to that, the school curriculum is just a tiny, tiny box. And of course, we want to push all of those rich features of the world around us in the school curriculum to make sure that students are prepared for every eventuality. But often, what happens is when we do that the beautiful, rich features of our societies arrive as very shallow shadows of themselves in school. If you have students in primary school, they all love science. Science is about experimenting, understanding nature, experimenting, distinguishing cause and effect. And then later on, when we ask them the question again in secondary school, many of them hate science because it just, got a world of formulas and equations that has very little to do with the nature of scientific inquiry. And we do that with more and more subjects. We often make learning a mile wide, but just an inch deep. The challenge is to bring the human aspect of learning back. The realm of human knowledge, the realm of ethics and judgment, the realm of political and civic life, the development of binding social capital that extends our radius and trust to strangers, the realm of creativity, aesthetics and design, the realm of natural and physical health, and of course the realm of economic life. And that is intimately tied to the well-being of students. We looked at that in the PISA assessment, and we find actually the well-being of students actually varies a lot across countries. But importantly, even within countries, often it varies strongly between students from social background. Now, students from wealthier background often show higher levels of well-being. Vietnam actually is a laudable exception to this, where we do not see that distinction playing so much out between the rich and the poor. What's also interesting, when we ask ourselves, what are the predictors of student well-being? You can see actually students' sense of belonging. Is school a place where I feel I belong, where I make friends, where I trust other people? Very strong predictor for student well-being. Some people say well-being is all about your friends, your family, but no, actually, school makes a huge difference on this. A cooperative school climate. And then, of course, parents' emotional support, where students feel, even if I make a mistake, I know my parents will support me. That will help me reach the next stage. We looked at more specifically at student satisfaction with their life, and there also you can see a positive disciplinary climate in school. Again, sense of belonging, very strong predictor for students' satisfaction with their own life. The perceived teacher support. Once again, do I have teachers who accompany me on my personal journey, who know who I am? who give me positive feedback. And we could also see, again, a collaborative learning climate was very important. So at the OECD, we have tried to bring all of this together to build this learning compass, as we call it. The idea here is, again, that learning is not about absorbing prefabricated content. It's to develop that inner compass that helps us in this complex, volatile world, that helps us make good decisions, distinguish right and wrong, good and bad, that gives us orientation. And that compass has to do with what we know. But also here we have to acknowledge that the world no longer rewards us just for what we know. Now Google knows everything. The world often rewards us for what we can do with what we know. This skills dimension. And when we talk about skills, it's not just about cognitive skills. Importantly, it's also about social and emotional skills. But even then, it's not everything. The attitudes that we bring to this. Remember, the findings on growth mindset and the values. Moving from situational values, I do whatever a situation allows me to do, to sustainable values that build that deep understanding that what I do today is going to make a difference for people in other places and people in later times. That, build that sustainability, keeping the world in balance, and also that resilience, living in a structurally imbalanced world. Let me show you, a couple of findings that we found very interesting. Tomorrow's schools need to help students to think for themselves and to join other students with empathy and work and citizenship. They need to help students develop a strong sense of right and wrong, a sensitivity to the claims which other people make on us, a grasp on the limits of individual and collective action. At work, at home, in a community, we need to learn how other people live, whether as scientists or artists, in different cultures and different traditions. The bottom line is, if we want to stay ahead, we have to understand the qualities that are unique to our humanity and that complement, not compete with the capacities we created in our computers. Education has done a fantastic job to help us understand the world around us and even explore faraway planets. Now is the time that we develop a better understanding of ourselves, our minds, our experiences. That's so important. I show you some data that is quite depressing. We recently looked at social emotional skills of young people, and in this context also at the creative skills. And what we found is that 15-year-olds were often less creative than 10-year-olds. Now, if I would tell you your 15-year-old students do worse in mathematics than your 10-year-old students, you would immediately say, well, there's something wrong in our school system. But we do not ask ourselves that question when it comes to creativity. Now, often because we take creativity as a kind of personality trend, not as one of the most central outcomes of learning. And that's such a pity because, we are all born with an abundance of creativity. If you have a 3-year-old son or daughter, they're going to question everything you tell them. They're going to experiment with anything that gets into their way. But they're always willing to learn and always willing to unlearn and relearn when the context changes. Children are incredibly creative. But then we put them to our schools and we try to make them compliant with our ways of thinking. We reward them when they produce the answers that we projected into the question, not when they find their own answers, different answers. But in the world of tomorrow, we need creative, happy children. And actually, it's not so difficult. Our data also shows that actually art activities were often related to creative capacities of children. There are certain school subjects that lend themselves to building those kinds of creative capacities among young people. In every city for which we have data, we found that relationship. But again, often we make the arts an extracurricular activity rather than putting them at the center of school activities. And that's not the end of the story. We should not see the arts and academic achievement as opposing ends on a spectrum. Now, they're actually quite closely related. Our research shows how skills in the arts relate very closely to important human capabilities. Now, for example, music education has empirically been shown to strengthen academic performance, word decoding, phonological skills, and there is evidence that music education might also facilitate foreign language learning. Theater education, for example, through enacting stories in the classroom, has been shown to strengthen verbal skills. And students who study the visual arts are stronger in geometrical reasoning than students who do not study the visual arts. And studies have shown that instruction in dance improves visual and spatial kind of relationship. There is evidence that dance education has that impact on visual spatial skills. A growing body of research shows all those kinds of relationship. We should take that seriously. But let me, bring you one step further. The World Health Organization has an interesting metric to assess the psychological well-being of students now. And we see that here for 10-year-olds. You can see a generally positive picture. 10-year-olds seem to be generally happy with their life. They say, my daily life is filled with things that interest me. I woke up feeling fresh and rested. I felt active and vigorous now. But when we look at the same figures for 15-year-olds, you can see the bars get a lot shorter now. Now, I know psychologists have lots of explanations for this. Now, when we become older, we become more self-critical, we become more aware, we see a lot of difficulties with our own lives. Now. But if that is so, shouldn't school become much more a place that relates to the well-being of students, where we actually look at this and see to what extent education can do something about it? Now. And our studies show that in really interesting way. Now, the results of our research show that students' social and emotional skills are very closely related to students' psychological well-being, even after accounting for social background and gender. And that's particularly the case for stress resistance, optimism, and energy. So students who are optimistic, who show that stress resistance and a greater sense of energy, positivism, they generally have a much more, positive sense of their own well-being. So those are the sources that drive well-being. And of course, that raises that very important question. How can we build that energy, that stress resistance, that optimism that drives student well-being? And the answer is surprisingly simple. Students who get along well with their teachers, they report consistently higher social and emotional skills, particularly greater curiosity, greater optimism, greater achievement motivation. And that same was true for almost any other social emotional skill that we measured. Their sense of responsibility, their persistence, their self-control, their stress resistance, their optimism, their emotional control, their empathy, their trust, their cooperation, their tolerance, their curiosity, their creativity, their sociability, their assertiveness, their energy, their self-efficacy, their achievement motivation. So building healthy, strong social relationships builds great social emotional skills. Those skills actually drive that optimism, resilience of students that then relates to their well-being. At the end of the day, if you think about it, we need students who have the knowledge, the skills and attitudes to adapt to different worlds which they live in. They need to connect experiences from their different worlds to create new opportunities for learning, whether it's alone or with their peers. Now, they need to feel a positive impact on the environment around them. They need to articulate their experiences and views, and they need to be listened to. And they are also supported to overcome their personal challenges. And importantly, they need to see change as an opportunity for their own learning, for their own growth. And of course, that tells us a lot about teachers. When you think about the kind of people that can do this, those need to provide dynamic and collaborative school networks. A strong collaborative culture is a key driver of this. An institutional culture that values people and processes over classroom, practice and devices. Staff that look to build strong partnerships with colleagues, with families, and often sometimes with private and non-profit sectors. Staff who are empowered to lead rich learning processes, united around a strong, a shared vision of ongoing improvement, and collaborative professionals with the confidence, the support and space to innovate and to benefit from quality learning experiences. It's not so difficult. And I know your Happy Schools Symposium is exactly the kind of environment that can help us make those things happen. Of course, it's not a clear-cut answer often. It's often a difficult balancing act. How do we reconcile the urgent that always dominates our minds with what is really important in the long run? How do we draw on the disrupting forces that often, like the pandemic, that galvanize social and technological innovation, while also, modernizing at a slower pace, more gradually? How do we reconcile new goals with our current structures? How do we develop students who rest in themselves, who are globally open, but actually also locally rooted in their own cultures and traditions? Because we know very well students who do not have a strong floor under their feet, they are the ones who are going to build walls around them. How do we foster innovation in an environment for education that is often very risk averse? How do we integrate the virtual world with the real world? A question we are all very much aware of. And finally, how do we find the right balance between learning and education? But I know at the Happy Schools Symposium, you're going to find good answers to those questions. Thank you very much.